It's a cold winter's morning, about 7 degrees, and the sun is bright, but having little impact on warming up this bleak concrete rectangle we're standing on. I'm in the intellectual disability unit of a maximum security prison, and my organisation is guiding a group of senior managers from a large Australian business through the prison for 2 days. And the group is here to learn about how does change and innovation happen in a really rule-bound environment. And you don't get more rule-bound than this. So we've just had our first meeting with staff, and the visitors have been briefed on where they are. And we're leaving the security of the meeting room and starting to engage with the prisoners for the first time. And it's awkward. And we've chosen this yard, this concrete rectangle, to try and find a non-threatening place to get to know each other. And as I'm standing there watching this, one of the inmates approaches me, and he's about 25, very white, short, with cropped hair, and exceedingly muscly. And I know this because all he's wearing is a singlet and shorts, and I'm wearing a jacket and a hat and shivering. I'll call him Rob. And Rob pushes forward a notebook, dog-eared, about 20 lines on there, written in a neat, tight hand in black ink. And I lean in to read it, and it's a poem about loneliness and love. And I hear my preconceptions crashing down in my head again. And I wonder, what am I doing here? I've gone from a life of comfort and predictability to one of not having the answers, to being challenged about my preconceptions and judgments all the time, while having to look like I've got it all together for the people around me. Rob's not interested in my wanderings. And he asked me, can I show them this? And I say, yes. And he says, are you sure? And I said, of course. And he looks beyond my shoulder and he walks over to the last of the group coming out of the meeting room. And it's 3 women together. And as he approaches them, I can see their faces tighten into a half grimace, half smile. And he pushes forward his notebook. And they lean in like I did and begin to read. And their faces unwind. This is a strange place, as I'm later to find out, to be given your first piece of poetry by a man, let alone a poem about love. Why do I tell this story? My organisation's work is to get people to understand and use their power well. We don't work with do-gooders. We work with people who are in IT, manufacturing, banking, government, community. They cross sector, culture, geography, level. What they share is an understanding, or at least the beginning of an understanding, that everything's connected. That the days of just thinking about money or people or the environment or culture are over. That we live and work in interconnected systems. And there's no better place to start to think about interconnection than this prison. Because what's happening here right now has everything to do with what goes on beyond the 4 walls. It's also a great place to start to talk and think about power, to see how it's used well and poorly or not at all, and to no longer be able to avoid differences of power. It's really stark and in your face. As much as we like to ignore that there are differences, here's a place where you can't avoid it. And we have an opportunity to think about, what does power have to do with compassion and care and love and bridging the divides between us. Not just control and management. And this is a question I can answer right now. Power has everything to do with compassion and care and love. And today I want to talk to you about the importance of power, the paradoxes of using it, and the impact of owning it. My colleagues and I spend a lot of time thinking and working with power, not only because it's at the core of leadership, but it's also at the core of family and community life. We would say that you actually can't exercise any leadership in any domain without some form of power, whether it's the formal power we're more familiar with through our structures and titles, or the more important power that we get through our experience, our knowledge, the hardships we experience, our successes and failures, our culture, our psychology, and our spirituality. But power is a challenge, and it's a global challenge. We're not unique in Australia in being challenged by it. It's full of paradoxes. You've probably seen some of them today. I'm going to talk about 4 paradoxes, which are not unique to Australia. You'll identify them from many places. But we would say the 4 of them come together here in a unique way. And they represent not only our challenge, but also the opportunity to transform it. And the first paradox, is that we're anti-authority and authority-dependent at the same time. We love to deride people in positions of power, yet we depend on them for protection and support. It's almost a national sport in Australia to bag people in positions of power. But think about how much we still want from them. The second paradox is that we're egalitarian and hierarchical at the same time. Being egalitarian, we're uncomfortable with different levels of power because we like the idea of equality. And we work in increasingly hierarchical systems. The larger we get, the more hierarchy we need. And I would argue that the more we want equality, the more hierarchy we need to maintain the equality. So that's the second paradox. The third paradox is that we're relational and competitive. And what I mean by that is we really value relationships, or what we call mateship in Australia. Relationships are an important part of work and community life, which means that competition and ambition are often in the shadows. And we haven't really found a way to put these two things together anywhere seemingly but the sports field. And finally, the fourth paradox is that we carry a narrative of adversity but live in unprecedented prosperity. All of these paradoxes hinge on power. But where does this challenge or this problem with power come from? Once again, this is a global story, but there's also a unique Australian part of it. In 2007, Prime Minister Rudd apologised to the stolen generation for the forced removal of 100,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. This was government policy between 1909 and 1969. And as you know, has had an incredible and difficult impact on not only Indigenous communities, but also on the relationship between Black and white Australia. How do we work together when there is so much fear, anger, shame, and guilt? This is a really hard place to own your power. You could also say that white Australia began with a process of forced removal. The first settlers in Australia didn't have such a great relationship with power either, many being sent here for petty crimes into a life of exile and depredation. And let's not forget the 500,000 forgotten Australians. Children, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, Australian-born, immigrants, taken out of their homes and into so-called care because of family breakdown, racist policies, and disadvantage over the last century. And the 150,000 children taken from unwed mothers by welfare agencies and churches, which was policy between 1950 and 1970 in Australia. 100,000, 500,000, 150,000. These are massive numbers in a country of just over 22 million people. And when we add to that the 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 9 boys who suffer child sexual abuse in Australia, we start to understand why we might have a bit of a problem with power. Why power is a problem and a threat and something to be avoided. And this, when we see and experience this kind of abuse, it's easy to become mistrustful and cynical or a permanent critic. But I would argue that we have the space and opportunity in Australia to transform our relationship with power. I'm not sure anyone else has such a large opportunity as us. But to transform it, we've got to own it, and we can't neglect it. So I work for Social Leadership Australia, and we work with power and privilege. We're trying to get people who have power to use it. And we sit inside a larger organisation called the Benevolent Society, Australia's oldest charity. And my colleagues work in communities and with families where abuse and neglect is endemic. And what professionals in this area know is that neglect is actually just as bad as abuse. With abuse, there's time for recovery. Neglect is always there. And the size of a child's brain that's experienced extreme neglect is significantly smaller than a normal child's brain size. And I would say there's a clear line here between this worst kind of neglect that we see in family life and what we experience in our organisations and communities. Out of fear of being the abuser, we neglect our power, and this hurts all of us. We can play a bigger role. In fact, no one else can. We can't vote it in. The challenges we face in our organisations and communities, the innovation we require, won't come from the top of the systems that we work in. The CEO, the minister, the Prime Minister can't solve all our problems. We know what happens when we abdicate. And we can play a bigger role. We're being called to play a bigger role, just like becoming a parent. We're being called to play a role where we have to think beyond ourselves and get over ourselves. And get over ourselves. And get over ourselves. Sorry, I'm still working on that one. There are 3 things we can do. The first is owning our power. It's really nice to be mates, but that doesn't help the disadvantaged or people with less power. In fact, having worked with a lot of people with disadvantage, it's really just irritating. Because nowhere is difference of power more obvious than for those with less. And what we fear is that by owning our power, we're going to become high-handed, is actually not what happens. In our work with organisations where we see bullying and harassment happening, it's not the people who are owning their power, it's the people who are not owning their power. And owning our power actually takes us into compassion and grace. We've seen some of that today. The second is being clear on purpose. Power is always in service. And we have to become a lot less forgiving and inclusive about what leadership means. Leadership is always, no matter where you are, what sector you are, what level you are, what community you're in, is always about creating a more just and compassionate society. It's in service, not a servant, but in service. And I would argue, and I see this in some of the organisations we work with, that this more inclusive, holistic idea of power and leadership, this one where we see the connection between things, is actually becoming the new competitive advantage. Because guess what? We're not just employees or voters. We're also citizens and members of a family. And nobody wants to just switch themselves off as they walk through the door at work. And the third thing is being clear on our role. That there's Geoff, but there's also me as a manager and a father and a son and a husband and a teacher. And those roles, like your roles, need honouring. And just like an actor can bring a script to life, first they've got to honour it. And then they can bring what's authentic about them into it. But we can't colonise it with our own stuff. We can't take it over. We've seen what happens when people colonise their organisations and communities with their own ego and desires. Surely we've had enough colonisation in Australia. When my daughter was 3, I remember another sunny winter morning sitting out on the front steps of our house, and she was going through a phase like a lot of kids do at that age, of repeating the same phrase over and over again. And this week it was, "I love you, Daddy." And of course it was really touching. And I didn't know what to do with it for a few days. And then, I'm embarrassed to admit, it started to provoke me. I was curious. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? How do you know what love is? And what have I done to deserve it? And I couldn't help myself. On this day, I had to ask, why? Why do you love me? And she barely blinked. Because you're my daddy. And in many ways, she's programmed to love me. She's got a lot invested in me getting this role right. Right? I'm one of the most important figures of power in her life. But like all of us, she's looking externally to power to do something. And in her growth, as she becomes an adult, she's going to have to pick up her own power. Just like us. Because as long as we're dependent on someone else, as long as mum or dad or the boss or those in charge are someone else, we're always dependent and we're at risk of becoming a victim. And I think about this as I walk through the streets of the city and I pass people and I look at them and I think, what's going on for you? What's your story about power? Have you been abused and neglected? And what are you going to do with yours? And that inevitably brings me back to you and me here, right now. Because like it or not, we have power and privilege. And what happens in the environments that we work in? What stories do we walk past every day? And we have a choice. We can pick up our power. We can transform the story. And we do that for one motivation only, and it's the only ever grounding use of power, and that's love. It's not something we've earned necessarily. We may not deserve our power. It's something we have that we can use to set others free. There are no big inspirational newspaper moments of leadership coming. They're the everyday moments where we pick up our power and use it well. It's not about changing the world, it's about changing the world we live in. One person at a time, one story about authority and power at a time. Thank you.